Okay, we have a little change in the program this morning. Apparently, at 8:30 this morning, the speaker from Rochester, who was going to be on Zoom, called to say she was ill. So we'll be having a presentation, but it will be a somewhat different presentation. Joan Brumberg, who many of you know, she lives at Kendall, Professor Emerita in History and Gender Studies, has been involved in this subject as a historian, not as a clinician, and has written and taught about the history of adolescent girls in America for many years. So she will step into the breach this morning and provide some historical context for this really very interesting subject. So, Joan?
Let me just tell you that this program with Kate Greenberg and myself has been in the planning for months. Jane Powers, who is here, is Chrissy here? Oh, okay, and Chrissy Schillhouse Miller helped me figure out how to do this, and we got a Rochester doctor involved, so Kate Greenberg's inability to come this morning was both a shock and kind of a loss, because the idea was to talk about the whole issue of adolescent sexuality and transgender collaboratively as a historian and Kate as a clinician. I will offer no clinical insights, okay? I know a little bit, but not much. I know at least one pediatrician in the audience, Marguerite Uphoff. There may be other doctors in the room, I'm not sure. But mine is strictly the historical, my historical fix on what Kate Greenberg is dealing with in her clinical practice. I think that's the right way to put it. Okay, so this was conceived as an educational program for grandparents and of course grandparents, and that's just the stand-in for the geriatric community, who need to better understand the lives of contemporary young people, especially issues of sexuality. Our speaker, Dr. Catherine Blumoff Greenberg, supposed to be our speaker, is an associate professor at the Department of Adolescent Psychiatry at the University of Rochester, where she trained as a physician specializing in adolescent sexuality and reproductive health, and she went to Johns Hopkins. She is the foremost resource for clinical information on transgender kids. So if that's an issue for you, just remember her name. It's important. There is not a lot of resources in this community. Specifically, we're talking about young people for whom sexuality is problematic. That is, those who are uneasy in some way about the gender identity that they were assigned at birth on the basis of what observed body parts. That's their sex. They are not to be confused. Don't confuse them with transvestites, those who dress up in the clothing of the other sex. Although an individual's behavior as a transgender person may include this transformative, performative dressing. And they are different from intersex, who are people whose genitals are chromosomes, don't fit into the traditional male-female binary, right? That's a new word for a lot of us. Intersex may have genitals that don't match reproductive organs, or they may have the traits of both. I had hoped that Kate would have been here to talk about this a little bit more. So I'll begin with where I can begin, about the latest form of trans behavior, which I heard about at Cornell, of course, in the early 2000s, among my female students, mostly advisees. I would be told, usually by young lesbians, that that suggested they preferred a male, they wanted a name change, not a nickname, a name change. That suggested they preferred a male gender identity. At the time, I remember wondering if this was a political or a social statement or both. I wasn't sure. And then about a decade later, I had a very close friend whose 34-year-old son, the father of two boys, actually used hormones and top-down surgery to become her daughter. When I moved to Kendall in 2020, I started to hear fellow KAI residents tell me that a grandchild had just changed their name or adopted a pronoun that they did not fully understand. There were boys who used she, there were girls who used he, some used they to indicate that they claim both female and male identity. Recently, The New Yorker published a biographical essay about a feminist hero. Sounds funny, feminist hero. Okay, that's all right. Only one person, it was only about one person. And then the article used her preferred pronoun they throughout the article. I have to admit, it's damn hard to read. It was annoying. And I realized then that I had to educate myself a bit about what was going on and what to expect in the years ahead. As a historian, my first questions were, when and where did this start? I mean, for historians, that's always a kind of root issue. These are not questions I can easily answer here. Don't expect an answer. It will take years, but historians and anthropologists do confirm already that trans behavior is not a 20th century invention, nor is it strictly American. What seems to be new is the age group at which transitioning begins and its relationship to the developmental process of adolescence. Many explanations are offered, from the influence of friends or persuasion of teachers and youth advisors, to social media, to environmental change, and even genetic change. Anybody have another one to throw in? I'm serious. If you have thoughts on that, let me know. So I want to begin with some quick images and a cough drop to situate. I want to use the images to further explain where we are. First of all, there are historians, and they are books trying to find examples from the past. This is one of the best that I have laid my hand. I have not read them all. Female Husbands of Trans History, Jen Mannion. It's a standard descriptive historical work. It's set in the UK. It covers the colonial period to World War I. And this historian has identified and focused on individuals in the 18th and 19th centuries who were assigned female at birth, but who lived as men and married women. Assigned female at birth, lived as men, and married women. And so rich, if you like Victorian studies or English history, it's really quite interesting. Anthropologists have a lot to say about this in terms of, particularly, my daughter-in-law has told me trans women in indigenous cultures. I have not read that work. If anybody has, let me know. Another writer who writes more broadly, this is really an encyclopedic book relating past to present. What Stryker does is an explanation of what used to be called gender dysphoria and its transition into the current transgender phenomenon, along with clear explanations of words like, as like a thesaurus, non-binary, cisgender, intersex. Again, I was hoping that Kate Greenberg would supply more on that. I'm not particularly insightful about the full range of the vocabulary that incorporates biomedical aspects. Well, my approach then is, as a historian, to use cultural images to get us thinking about our history, our cohort's history with this issue and where we are now. So let me begin with what I think is our first experience. 1952, Christine Jorgensen. Does the name ring a bell? We can date how old people are, right? Whether they're nodding their heads or shaking their heads. Jorgensen was the first successful gender reassignment in the United States. She actually worked in the army and then went to live in Denmark to get away from the publicity in the US. It was all over the front page of the Daily Mirror in New York. And she did report having childhood feelings of being trapped inside a female body. Then 20 years later, we learned about Renee Richards, who grew up as a boy and went to Horace Mann and Yale. Her mother was one of the first women psychiatrists in the country. Renee Richards trained at the University of Rochester in ophthalmology. And then she went out on the professional tennis circuit. And in 1976, she had her male to female sexual reassignment surgery. And then she sued to play at the US Open as a woman. It's the first time it comes up in sports, as far as I can tell, because it's a big issue now in sports. The US Tennis Association blocked her, and then the state passed a law that overturned it, so she did play. Again, it's the first controversy that I know of, others may, of sex and gender in sports. And Richards did go on, of course, to coach Martina Navratilova. So she was around in the tennis world for quite a long time. I believe she still is. People know who this is. Eddie Izzard. Eddie Izzard, born male in 1962. He's a British actor, stand-up comedian. He has quite a career on the stage, film, London theater. He always plays at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. David and I got to see him there. He identifies as transgender, but the way he says it is with humor. Sometimes I'm girlish and sometimes I'm boyish. He changed his name to Susie Eddie Izzard and continues to wear a dress and defend transvestitism vehemently. But he will never, he says, use they. I'm only a he or a she. You can see that the whole issue of pronouns is controversial, but yet we all get things now from our grandchildren, official letters. People all use the pronouns with slashes in terms of what they have chosen. I don't think there are a lot of people here at Kendall who are engaged in the pronoun choice, but if they are, so be it. I mean, it is part of what's going on. This is familiar now, but it wasn't 20, 25 years ago. I can't really date it. I haven't studied this in detail. It used to be just, the first change was unisex, right? And then we moved to this particular sign, which of course symbolizes transgender. Now, we're not supposed to give political talks at Kendall, so I will refrain from being terribly direct, but there is abroad in the land a lot of fear tactics about what is happening to our young people and their sexuality and how it is going to ruin the nation. These fear tactics usually run along this theme. An image of a boy in a bathroom using tampons. This is derived from MAGA politics. Donald Trump has woven into this story his story of what will make America great again, the idea of that Democrats are doing forced gender transition surgery in schools. I did not want to read this to you, but you can find it. It's easy to find. These are fear tactics that have to do with the sexuality of our kids. In Tennessee, I think it's the worst. Tennessee has been highly controversial the past year. The issue of transgender medical care. There's a legislative war over it. And they call it child mutilation. So despite the fact that the consensus among American and British medical groups is that multidisciplinary care is the best and most effective way to promote healthy development and reduce stigma and discrimination, that transgender care then has been authorized by the AMA. Many people are still refusing, think about it, and they're opposed to giving this kind of help to these young people or their families that also need help in how to deal with these kids. I was surprised. I've always thought the National Health Service was really enlightened, but no. Hilary Cass is an English pediatrician who has cast doubt on all the medical findings that transgender healthcare works. In fact, she spearheaded a movement in the UK to cut gender-affirming care at the NHS. It's a huge controversy, actually, in the streets. The Cass report is now known internationally by pediatricians and adolescent specialists. They talk about the Cass report. And this flag from England represents the national controversy over transgender healthcare, which now exists on both sides of the Atlantic. At the center of the discussion seems to be the use and effectiveness of puberty blockers. I don't know personally about the issue of age. When is the right time to use these puberty blockers if you're going to use them? I have a colleague from Cornell who has a distinct recommendation. It's quite young. He says that puberty blockers helps make puberty easier for a transgender child. I know pediatricians who say, but puberty is difficult for all children. Do we need to start the process so young? So that's still going on. I hope maybe Marguerite has some thoughts about that. I don't know. I'd hope that Kate Greenberg would have. Now, I just want to point out again, the American Medical Association does support health insurance for transgender youth, and Walmart and Starbucks actually cover transgender medical care. Talk about seeping into the culture. So gender affirming care is happening, even if we don't understand it, and even if we don't want it, it's here. So just a few more bits of evidence about where we are. Again, sports, I don't know if that's because of my son, who's a fanatic, but this is it's a good area for thinking about what's happening. Okay, you may know this person. I see Andrea nodding. Caitlyn Jenner. Okay? Caitlyn Marie Jenner. She's 76 years old. She was Bruce Jenner. And I wish I had the contrast picture. I should have done that. I thought about it last night, but didn't have enough energy. Bruce Jenner was the 1976 Olympic decathlon winner. He had, a massive, beautifully formed athletic body, and he was on the Wheaties box in 1977. All right. Caitlyn, had a 5-year transition program, which took estrogen, and electrolysis, and also psychotherapeutic help, all three. She became Caitlyn Jenner in 2015 with a huge national TV program. 17 million people watched that television special. That was in 2015. So we were getting more familiar with the idea of trans. This is someone I knew nothing about. Ray Libman, born female, a trans ice skater. In the 2003 Olympics, Ray was allowed to perform as both a man and as a woman. In other words, in separate events, which is unusual. It did not happen again. And Caster Semenya, 33-year-old South African middle distance runner, won 2 women's Olympic gold medals at least, and it was assigned female at birth and was Is something going wrong here, or is it me? Okay, was assigned female at birth, and ran as a female. But then there was trouble when the committee insisted on sex testing, and it turned out that Caster is intersex, and her testosterone is high. It's in the male range, and also maybe there's a scientist in here who can explain this. She also has something called the 5A reductase 2 deficiency, which contributes to the trans body. Okay, so she had these 2 markers that, according to the Olympics, said, can't participate as a female anymore. And these debates are still going on with the Olympic Committee. Here are some pop culture figures just to close. My kids knew all about all of these. Do you recognize anybody besides Laverne Cox? I didn't. In the middle? Okay. The woman on the left, Laura Jane Grace, was born female. She was a member of a punk rock band called Against Me. Looking for Neil to nod. Do you know that group? No, you won't be bringing them. All right. Against Me. She's one of the first to come out as a trans in the punk rock world in 2012. And she did it, she said, because her song, she wanted to indicate that the punk rock scene was too male centric. She didn't like the words in the songs. It sounded misogynistic to her, and she felt like a woman. And one of her hit songs was Transgender Dysphoria Blues in 2019. And she underwent feminine facial feminization surgery. Laverne Cox in the middle is the only person I knew in this group. She's a well-known actress, the first transgender person to be nominated for an Emmy for Orange is the New Black. I don't know if you remember that. It was good. It was interesting. She was the first transgender person to appear on the cover of Time. And when she became famous, she was invited to the Katie Couric show. and of course questioned about her transition. And she spoke out and she said, this is a quote, "I do feel that there is a preoccupation with that. The preoccupation with transition and surgery objectifies us trans people." And Cox, as a result of this view, has become a trailblazer in civil rights for LGBT people. Finally, Elliot Page. Somebody said, yes, they have heard of him. Okay. Assigned female at birth in 1987, pretty young. Given the name Ellen, came out as gay in 2014, and then as a trans man in 2020. After dramatic performances in civil rights activism in Canada, he's Canadian. In 2021, he became the first openly trans man on Time magazine. Many know him from Juno movie, and also he wrote a book just last year, 2023, called Page Boy, which made the New York Times bestseller list. He publicly changed his name to Elliot, specifying that he would use the pronouns he and they. And in an interview in Time in 2021, he described himself as queer non-binary and recovering from top surgery. Now, I could go on, but won't. Kate was supposed to be, I'm supposed to be introducing Kate now. I tried to describe many changes and a lot of relatively new language and the direction of the scholarship and also the changes that we're all facing. I guess the thing now is the best thing to do, since Dr. Greenberg isn't here, is to just ask for comments and questions from, I'll try to answer what I can. Yeah, Chrissy.
1 second. Test, test, test. Okay. Can you hear me? No. Closer?
I can introduce the speaker.
Okay.
Chrissy Schillhouse-Miller taught human development at Cornell for decades and decades.
And I taught adolescent
Adolescent
development.
psychology too, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
I speak to the use of the word they as a singular pronoun. My daughter, many years ago, had a friend who used they. And I said to her, honey, it's a plural pronoun. I have a lot of trouble as somebody who tries to use proper grammar to use it as a singular pronoun. And a few years ago, Merriam-Webster came out and accepted it as a singular pronoun. And my daughter sent me news flash. So there you go.
Okay, new world. I mean, I'm not against it. I just admit that I find it difficult to read, most of all. I mean, if you're reading a biography of someone and the central figure is called they, you stop every once in a while and say, who? What? But I think it's interesting, Chrissy, to find that out. I didn't know that. Yeah.
We also have Corey Ellen Gattrall here, who says she's a friend of yours, and
She is in Massachusetts.
yes,
Okay.
which is great. And she's a nurse who knows, has a lot of transgender clinical knowledge, and is also a mother of transgenders youth. And so she is here to answer any questions as well. She can type them in the chat. So
Oh, Corey, thank you. Your kids are great.
So if anybody has any questions, I can pass you the mic as well.
Yeah.
Hi, Joan, thank you. I just had a comment about they, and because it kind of bothered me as a grammar nerd as well. But I heard, for one thing, I'm sure many of you listen to the NPR show Way with Words, and they said historically they has been used as a singular, and they gave examples. But the other thing I like about it, this is Brenda.
Okay, all right. There's a light on you.
Oh, Is it
May I
heavenly?
identify you? I mean, because the people who are speaking have knowledge. This is Brenda Marston, who has been the curator of the Human Sexuality Collection at Cornell since, I can almost date it, 1989.
9.
Okay.
Way to go. Oh, but the other thing I was going to just say about they is myself as a feminist. You know, I'm very aware of, like, as strong of a feminist as I am, I still have implicit bias, and it
Mhm.
bugs me. And when I see things like a coyote go by, I typically would say, I saw a coyote, he was blah. And I was like, oh, stop always using he as the default. So I really like using they, because I think it's in line with not making gender assumptions, and it seems respectful and positive to me in that way.
That's really helpful, Brenda, for me, who's been having the they problem. That it's inclusive of both, and we kind of default to he all the time.
Hi, Joan. So a comment and a question. The comment is when you talked about fear tactics, my understanding is that there's a lot of money out there using them to oppose the New York State Equal Rights Amendment.
That is true.
And it's quite disturbing to see this because what they're putting out there is not true things that people might be concerned about. It's the sort of made up stuff about how kids are going to be, that if the amendment passes, kids are going to be forced to trans and so on.
Yes, and all people, teachers and youth leaders are, basically into pedophilia and trying to turn children into the other sex. I mean, it's a nasty.
Yeah. So I'm afraid we'll see a lot of advertising because there's a lot of money out opposing the amendment and putting that kind of stuff out there. The other thing is, as someone who grew up comfortable being a woman and so on, I find that, intellectually, I can understand trans people who transition, and I know a few people, but I find that I don't have it's hard for me to sense what it would be like to be someone in that kind of a situation. So I wonder if there's some good literature out there that some of us could read that would help us just understand what it's really like, both feeling that you want to go through the process and then what it's like.
Well, I can't right now come up with a novel. Maybe Brenda, might you help? But I can tell you that the second book that I mentioned here has a beautifully written and argued prose description, not fictive, prose of how people react when they have to consider a being whose sexuality they don't know. It's a beautiful description of the shock and the almost human trained into you, socialized into you, inability to think another way about sexuality. It's really terrific, but I'm sure there's good fiction. Oh, Jennifer Boylan, she's not there. Marcy?
There's another book, As Nature Made Him. And I know about that book because there's a quote from my uncle who was a psychiatrist.
As Nature Made Him, okay.
As the librarian, I'd be glad to send you a list of books after this. But also the one that comes to mind is there's a number of young adult novels
Yes.
that deal with this, and one is by Madeline George, who's the Cornell alum. So you can.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, actually, I thought it would be a good idea to have like a reading list.
I'm just wondering, we know there are a lot of chemicals now, you know, in our water, soil, packaging and so on that affect the endocrine system. And I'm wondering whether there is an uptake now in the number of people or proportion to the rest of the population that are not sure about or are having, you know, not completely binary. So, I mean, not completely, you know, sure of their sex or whatever.
I think you're asking two questions.
Okay.
One is about environmental causation. I can't answer that for you, okay? I just can't, I'm not a scientist. As to the uptick in the numbers, the answer is yes. Just like back in the 80s, when I was writing a book about the history of anorexia nervosa, I was living through a period of more and more cases. It's also more and more identification, more diagnosis, more people who are presenting with ambivalence or anxiety about sexuality in youth. And they're, depending upon their therapist, it could be suggested you may have something that we used to call gender dysphoria. You know, I think it's really complex. I just add something that I know. A former student of mine who's the director of a very well-known progressive residential school for kids on the spectrum, but they're challenged intellectually. Very, very bright. And Jane, maybe you or Chrissy could help me. This is somebody who is like a Bronfenbrenner cohort person. It's kind of a German Jewish name in Chicago, the school. Anyway, it's a really well, highly regarded school. And it has lots and lots of kids from the ages of like 10, David, you heard this conversation, 10 to like 18. They're not, they don't have intellectual deficits. They have emotional issues that we call spectrum disorders. All right, a lot of them are autistic. And a lot of them now are suffering with becoming trans. I just thought that was extremely interesting, that kind of confluence of spectrum, what we call spectrum disorder very loosely now, and trans youth. I don't know what to make of it. I had hoped that Kate was here.
Could you also comment on the impact of social media on all of these things that are now being talked about?
Well, I think social media has an impact on kids profound impact that we can't understand. You know, I don't think somebody watches one television program and says, "Ooh, I'm going to become a boy," you know, or become a girl. But I think that it's possible if you're in the stage of development where any adolescent is, where you've got your antennae out and you're thinking about who do you want to be with and what kind of person do you want to become. Take Chrissy's course. All of these processes, right now, the menu would be longer. There would be more choices and more options.
Thinking more about Facebook.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Facebook too. Yeah, sure, you could get friended and join a group. Not that I know how to do that yet. Yeah, I think it's there's just so much more opportunity for everything for young people, you know, including not reading or, you know, I mean, it's very hard to get our minds behind the way they think. And even the ones that we love dearly and think we know very, very well, occasionally come out, this is at least my case, with my 30-some-odd-year-old granddaughter, course, one of whom I respect enormously as a young woman, as a woman. And every once in a while, she'll say something and it's like a foreign language talking about. I don't know it, Ron.
Joan, I want to, well, first of all, I want to thank you for stepping into the breach at 8:30 in the morning to come up with this talk. And it obviously is a hot button talk. An interesting question came about the role of social media. I mean, I have a feeling, my own, so I have a comment and then I have a question. Comment is that I think that we live in a world of social media, very strongly influencing a lot of people, but mainly the young and at critical ages. I think the problem or situation of identity and transgenderism has been with civilization for a very long time. I think only now have people felt some way to actually say it, and more to your point, to find others who share in those feelings, because it's a matter of feelings. Now, with respect to feelings and sports, you raised a very interesting issue. I'm an avid sports fan in virtually every sport, and I'm very aware of the controversies in swimming. And straight women who have perfectly fine, good, liberal, and open attitudes find it problematic that somebody should, on the basis of their identity, a decision on their part, usually post-puberty, then wants to now switch sports, or usually it's male to female. And I'm a biologist, and I'm not an endocrinologist, but I'm a neurobiologist, and I do see that this is a problematic issue, because if you cross adolescence as a male, that has done something. Adolescence turns on any number of pathways, including how your muscles develop and the proportion of muscles that you may have. And making a decision later on does not change that. Now, of course, with training, we're in early days. We don't know what you can do if you make a decision to change your body. But I don't know that it's very easy to change muscle type quickly at all. And so I'm just raising the issue that, in fact, there's an issue of biology here, as well as choice. And we don't quite know where to come down on this, trying to be open. I have known transsexual and bisexual people virtually all of my life, because when I was a kid, I grew up in a public setting where all kinds of people came and met. So I'm very familiar with the problem since 9 years old, or not a problem, situation. And I think that that's been with us for so long. And I think that, thank you, Joan, for raising the subject, because I think that it's not talked about enough. And in fact, if I look out at the audience, there's a sex skew here. There are more women here than men. Now, that may reflect the longevity statistics of a place of any elder care facility, but I do think that there is a sense of denial and great unease, more so among men than women. And I will be happy to, that's just my 2 bits. I found your talk very stimulating. I thank you. Now, are there other questions? Yes.
Corey, the nurse from the chat, says House of Hidden Meanings is RuPaul's memoir. And she can also send more suggestions later as well. And Try This is How It Always Is by Laura Frankel. There's another one. She also says endocrine disruptors are known to be associated with puberty, but not prevalence of gender identity. And social media helps young people connect and find support. Kids who were too isolated to feel safe in their identities before now have more resources and more knowledge.
Thanks, Corey. If you could send me those book titles, I'd appreciate it. The Kindle library is all of a sudden gonna get bombarded with things they didn't expect. Marcy?
There's also a blog from a professor at SUNY Binghamton in the computer science department. Her first name now is Jessica, it used to be a different Gerald or something like that. And she kept a blog while she was going through her transition. And it's online. I can find out the link.
Why don't we collect it all together? I'm happy to do that. There are lots of blogs. And, you know, again, the social media is just loaded. Rita's got a question. But Anne?
I'm Ann Coyne. I'm a professor of social work at Nebraska. What we're seeing in this is that speaking to people who have transitioned as adults, they knew from the time they were very little that they were a different gender. We're beginning to see children who have always identified as different being allowed to be different in their families and being allowed to dress as girls, even though they were born as boys. They're not teased the way they used to be.
That's right.
About being a sissy. You know, I think there's I think that's why we're seeing more younger, that their transition is really taking place at age 2 or 3 or 4, rather than at 56.
So what you're saying is not so much a transition in the child, but a change in the environment as children are socialized.
Exactly. And they're being socialized as they're allowed to go to school in dresses. They're being socialized as girls, even though physically they're boys.
Ooh, I'm sorry, the podium just moved.
Thank you, Joan. I think you gave a very interesting and stimulating talk, and it stimulated, I think, a very rich discussion. What I would like to say is development is a tremendously complex process. There isn't anything simple about it, and somehow we've defined male and female culturally as two separate things, but I don't think nature ever did that. And
well, you're saying that there is no real binary culture.
There are so many complex issues that affect the developing organism. All of the things that we have, you mentioned very nicely. I would add to what you mentioned. How about the microbiome? How about all those bacteria that are signaling and influencing how we develop, along with everything else that goes into that development? And the idea that politicians should decide how any individual resolves that development is just absolutely nonsense. It's crazy.
You have the biological language, but that I don't understand, but I totally agree with you about what to make of it.
Well, thank you, Joan.
Here's another biologist.
Thank you. So Calvo, I taught human genetics at Cornell for about 25 years. And I wanted to go back to Esther's comment about the environment. We know that there are endocrine inhibitors in the environment, and frogs have behaved weirdly. And we don't think that's a social phenomenon.
Thanks. Yeah. I think Kate would really have something to contribute on this genetics business, but I can't repeat the argument very much. Yeah.
Just one question for Rita. I mean, my impression is that we're getting a lot of estrogen in, like from the plastics and things like that. And is that also contributing to things?
That and I'm somewhat out of date, but I think the problem is more the endocrine disruptors. But I need to go update.
I think we're gonna have to end. I would like to end though. I'm sorry that I didn't bring this wonderful piece that's serious about how we react to sexual sex that is the other. But instead, I thought about closing with a very funny joke that some of you may have heard. It's truthful. It's just a story. David, you may have to help me out. This involves Jeremy Bem. I don't know how many of you knew Sandy and Daryl Bem. I think some of you can help me with this if I don't get it right. They were psychologists at Cornell and Stanford. They were famous for their theories of androgyny. This was before the trans movement. So the deal was that, you know, girls were girls based on their biology and boys were boys based on their biology. And while there might be some common areas, you know, we didn't have to cast people hard and fast in those rules. Am I stating the theory of androgyny correctly? Help me out. I'm a little bit worn out. Okay. So Emily Bem, the daughter, wears barrettes, and her younger brother Daryl starts wearing barrettes, and Daryl wears barrettes. I'm sorry, Jeremy. Daryl is still with us. Daryl wears barrettes to school, and a little boy, Jeremy, wears barrettes to school, and a little boy says to him, "Jeremy, you're wearing barrettes. You're..." And Jeremy responds, "I'm no girl." And he pulls down his pants off his penis, because that's how his parents thought that was a boy. And if you didn't have one, something you had, I'm sure Sandy and Daryl used the word vagina. If you had that, you were a girl. And the boy looks at him and says, "Everybody's got one of those. Only girls wear barrettes." It's a great story about the way the world has worked for a very long time. So I'll end with that.